Listen, I get it. There are so many switches out there right now that it's almost dizzying. And for some reason, there are some crowd favorites that are just hard to get. Case in point are the Tangerine switches by C3 Equals. The C3 Equals Tangerine has been a crowd favorite for their smooth operation as well as their fun colorway. I know that I did poke fun at JWK before for their recolors, but at the very least, JWK knows how to name their switches properly. So when I had a chance to try out the Quartz R2s, I decided I need to let all those Tangie lovers know about the Switch because it's essentially a long stem pole version of a Tangie. Just color like the quartz crystal, hence the naming quartz. If this was up to Gateron, they probably would have named it something like Unicorn Candy Cane Princess. I don't know, but probably.
So the Quartz is a linear switch made by JWK. So this is the R2 version of the Quartz switch. If it's the R2, then how is it different from the R1? Well, let me tell you. The two major differences are that the R2 has a new stem length. It's a long stem design now, which also means 3.5 millimeters of travel versus the standard 4.0. Whether you like that or not, your mileage may vary. But long stems also mean that it has a harder single point bottom out. It usually results in a louder, crisper, and some say cleaner bottom out sound as well. The next big change was a turbo trick spring. Why is it a trick spring, you say? Because this is a 2-in-1 type of spring. So let me explain. So the spring itself is tapered. It's wider on one end and narrower on the other. The reason for this is that if you have a wider end facing down, the spring is actually a slow spring. This means the overall feel of the spring is fairly consistent from the initial key press all the way down to the bottom out, and usually the spring feels a little bit more loaded at top. So the Gateron Yellow is actually famous for this type of feel. If you flip the spring the other way, with the narrow side down, the spring becomes complex. The complex springs are in between a standard linear and a progressive spring. So what happens with these types of springs is that it becomes heavier as you get closer to bottoming out. These types of springs usually are meant for you to avoid bottoming out really hard and also feels a little bit more bouncier. So the Quartz R2 comes with the ability to go either way, a really good concept to help users determine what they like without buying additional springs. And finally, this one is a little bit less monumental, but the R2 has a matte finished top housing versus the R1's glossy. It just helped to differentiate the two different versions. Alright, so let's move on to the details of the Switch. One thing I noticed immediately is that this Quartz Switch is employing JWK's updated molds, which means it's much tighter and doesn't require the use of film. It's a huge improvement over the V1 molds. So the top housing of the Quartz R2 is made up of polycarbonate and nylon blend. Nothing too special about this, especially compared to Tangie's UHMWP housing. The bottom housing is made up of a polyamide blend. That's actually also a fancy name for a nylon blend. However, this lower housing is exceptionally smooth. I'll cover that later. The new stem is what JWK calls a P3 stem. This is a long stem mold and it's made up of UHMWP blend as well. So this is also going to help the Quartz make up some of that lost ground in terms of smoothness against the Tangie standard POM stem. I also wonder if JWK is polishing these stems like Gateron is doing on some of their more premium offerings because these are actually very smooth. If you compare the stem against the Tangie, you can easily see that the Quartz P3 stem is noticeably longer. I also decided to compare it against another JWK long stem, the one from the Durock POM. Overall length seems to be the same, but I did notice different mold markings, so the stem from the POM and the P3 stems are most likely different. As mentioned before, the spring is a unique turbo 63.5 gram spring from Korea. Not sure if the country of origin matters much, but many great springs do come from Korea, so hey, why not? In stock form, the Quartz Switch does come with a spring in slow configuration. The springs do have some ping stock since it comes completely unlubed. However, lubing it with some Krytox 105 or Super Lube oil does take care of it. Alright, let's move on to some testing. In order for me to show how these are, I'm also comparing them relative to some other similar switches on the market. For the most part, I chose other long stem switches to compare, with the sole exception of the Tangerines since I do feel these are very similar to Tangerines. So we're looking at the Durock POMs, the NK Creams, the Tecsee Carrots, and of course, the Tangies. So I changed things up a little bit since the Oil King review to be objective as possible. One of the things is the usage of a caliper to measure the stem wobble versus just my opinion, so let's take a look. As you can see here, I measured both the horizontal deflection as well as the vertical deflection, and then I also show the maximum diagonal deflection based on that. It's no surprise that the best stem wobble performance comes from the Durock POMs. I have mentioned a few times before, but the Durock POMs are one of the tightest stem to housing fit, and there's almost no movement. This is evident by its 0.28mm max diagonal deflection. Next up is a Tangerine, also a switch known for its super tight stem fit, showing off a very commendable 0.42mm. I can't believe that this is actually a switch from 2020 with this kind of performance. Third is the NK Cream. You're probably thinking, what? NK Creams were never good in this before. How are these three? Well, this is the NK Cream Launch Edition, so this is actually a new mold where the stem is actually larger and bigger than the previous version. With this version, the fit is definitely tighter, almost as good as the Tangerine. The Quartz Switch comes fourth, tying it up with the Tecsee Carrots, but honestly, 0.5mm diagonal deflection is a very low wobble switch that is actually equivalent to Gateron's newest housings like the CJs and the Oil Kings. The others are just insanely tight in this group. So the wobble performance is very good. What about the smoothness? As mentioned before, the combination of the polyamide blend and the UHMWP stem, the Quartz is smooth, crazy smooth. Dare I say it? It's a tad bit smoother than the Tangerines, for reals. Is it CJ smooth? I feel like it's almost CJ smooth, but maybe just a half a step behind, but it's very, very smooth. So at this point, we have a super smooth, very tight linear switch with an attractive pink housing and off-white stem. Does really look like a quartz crystal. What about the sound? I know that this is really important for many of you, so let's move into it. But before we do that, I want to do a quick shout out to Tim and his site, ShopMech.com. As mentioned before, ShopMech is a site that helps to aggregate all types of keyboard and keyboard components into a one-stop platform so that you don't have to search everywhere. It hosts pretty much everything you need, from switches to keycaps to parts and even keyboards. And what's new is that ShopMech.com features the Keyboard Builder. Keyboard Builder is a parts picker tool that helps you choose various different components to put together into an entire keyboard. What's nice is that it shows you sites and their prices, so you could cross-shop without going to these sites individually. Once you have all your parts picked out, you can save the build and share it with others as well. I'll show you an example in the link below for this Portico build specifically, so check it out. So like before, rather than just my subjective opinion on how deep a switch is, I decided to use a spectrum analyzer. This tells me the frequency. What is interesting is that a switch won't throw a single frequency of sound, rather it'll be a spectrum. However, a pattern develops where you see some dominant ranges showing up, showing how deep the housing collisions can be. The upper frequencies can be from springs, leaf, and etc. as well. All of the sound tests are done on my Portico with an aluminum plate and also with the ePBT Doubleshot ABS Keycaps. So based on this is what I put together from the spectrum analyzer. As you see here, the switches show a range of lower frequencies and higher frequencies. It seems interesting, but most switches actually don't throw too much sound between the 200 and the 600 Hz it seems. But most people are looking at the lower frequency housing collisions, it seems, for that talk. Given that, I have highlighted the dominant range for each switch. What is very interesting is the comparison between the Quartz R2 and the Tangerines. The sound from these two switches are so close. The Quartz R2 is a tad bit louder, perhaps slightly lower pitched than the Tangerines, but honestly, they are so close. It just seems like the Tangies have a bit more reach on the higher end. The rest of the long pole switches come very close to each other as well. Out of the 3 long pole switches, the Tecsee Carrots did seem to have the deepest pitch, but these 3 are very close to each other. It's interesting that my previous testing on the Oil King and Friends actually showed off more diversity in sound, but this batch, very close to each other. Perhaps when long stem pole is involved, it emphasizes a certain sound more than just a standard stem. But this together with what my ears are hearing, I will rank these in order for you as well. Backed by popular demand, here is the Switch performance chart. It incorporates the objective tests I have shown before and also blends in my subjective opinion as well. So as usual, we'll be looking at 5 different criteria for the Switch performance. It'll be stem wobble, switch smoothness, switch sound level, sound pitch, or frequency, and finally, the cost. First up is the stem wobble. So as shown in the deflection chart before, the winner of this group is the Durock POM. The Durock POM, also known as the piano switch, is just a super tight switch, so no surprises here. Following the Durock POM are the rest of the switches, with them all kinda so close to each other. Pretty much within 0.1mm of each other in terms of diagonal deflection, so all pretty much comparable in my opinion. Next up is the smoothness. As I mentioned before, the Quartz R2 is a very smooth switch. I feel that through this test, the Quartz R2 has proven itself to be a tad bit smoother than the Tangies. Both are so smooth that it was such a hard conclusion, but the more I used them, it was pretty evident. After these two, the Durock POM with its own UHMWP stem comes close third, followed by the Tecsee Carrots and the NK Creams. Mind you, these NK Creams are the broken in ones, so they're far smoother than stock NK Creams. Alright, moving on to sound. First sound criteria is the sound level. This is whether the switch is clacky loud or quiet. Out of this group, I would say that the NK Creams are probably one of the loudest switches. It's then followed by the Tecsee Carrots and the Durock POM. Honestly, these 3 are so close to each other though, then I would consider them pretty similar to each other as well. Then in the medium range is the Quartz R2 and the Tangerines. I would say that the long stem pole of the Quartz helps to emphasize the sound more, hence making it a bit louder. Next sound criteria is the pitch. So this is the combination of the objective spectrum analysis as well as my opinion. So I believe at this time, we know that the Tangerines are considered a clackier switch. So if you can see that it does register pretty high here, and also, evident on the spectrum analyzer as well. The Quartz switch being so similar to it also shows a clackier sound signature similar to the Tangerines. After the 2 clackier switches, the rest I feel are on the medium to medium thock. As mentioned before, the 3 long pole switches are pretty similar to each other and showed a solid result. However, out of the 3, I would say that the Tecsee Carrots are the deepest, with the Durock POMs being a little bit less so. These all have a nice solid medium to medium thock profile, I would say. I feel like I'm describing a steak or something. And finally, the fully objective criteria here, the cost. At the time of this testing, other than the Tecsee Carrots being the cheapest here at 54 cents, the rest are pretty much the same. The Quartz R2 was technically the most expensive at 68 cents a pop, but the Durock POMs are just 1 cent behind, and the Tangies and NK Creams are just 2 cents behind that. So they are all within 3 cents of each other. So I hope that the slew of tests and this chart helps to put things into perspective in terms of the various performance metrics and helps you make the best decision in terms of what you are looking for. Alright, with now everything out of the way, let's do the full typing test with the Quartz R2s all lubed. The Quartz come factory completely unlubed, so lubing is necessary to get the most out of them. No film is necessary though for these new JWK molds because they're very tight to start with. So let's check it out. So now that you heard all the sound tests and all the other metrics, I hope you can see when I said that these are like Tangies. They're seriously like a long stem pole version of the Tangerine Switches. At the time of the review, the Quartz R2s were in stock. I hope they stay like that for a little bit. I really did enjoy these switches quite a bit, and I'll definitely be buying a few more batches to keep around in case I need a Tangerine alternative. Well, I guess that's not fair to say since I do feel that these do stand on their own and in some cases are even better than the Tangies as well, so. One thing to note, yes, they do have a long stem, but the upper housing on the JWK switches were not really made for north-facing PCBs. So while they don't feel terrible with it, you can expect there to be some interference with the cherry profile caps. Just something to think about. I hope the video was helpful, and I hope these switch reviews help to shed some light. If you like Tangies and want Tangies but can't get them, or you like Tangies but you want a long stem pole version, well, now you know that the Quartz R2s are exactly that. So, happy keyboarding. Thanks.